All right, I think we're good to get started. So I just wanted to start off by welcoming everyone to Elbow Lake Environmental Education Center's third virtual public outreach event for the summer of 2020. We're very excited to have you all with us this evening for the Invasive Species in the Frontenac Arch webinar with Megan Quinn from the Nature Conservancy of Canada. The Elbow Lake Environmental Education Centre is the result of an agreement between the Queen's University Biological Station and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. NCC is Canada's leading national land conservation organization that partners with corporate and landowners to secure properties for the conservation of biodiversity. Throughout the summer, we will be hosting virtual bi-weekly outreach events, so please stay tuned on Elbow Lake Environmental Education Center's website and social media for more information. My name is Lindsay Ray, and I am one of the Outreach and Stewardship interns at the Queen's University Biological Station. Myself, along with Megan White, the other Outreach and Stewardship intern, and Sarah Oldenberger, the Outreach and Teaching Coordinator, will be facilitating this event tonight. We ask that you please keep your audio and video turned off throughout the webinar and type your questions into the chat box. The chat icon is located at the bottom of the Zoom window. We will monitor this chat box throughout, and we will have a Q&A period about halfway through the presentation and another one at the end. Please note that we will be recording this webinar and it will be available after this presentation on the CUBE's YouTube channel in case you need to leave early or wish to share it with your networks. So we would like to begin by acknowledging the territory that we are thankful to be situated on. Queen's University is situated on traditional Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee territory. Specifically, the Elbow Lake Environmental Education Center is situated on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory and is a part of the Algonquin land claim by the Algonquins of Ontario, currently under negotiation with the federal government of Canada. Acknowledgement of these facts requires recognition of the pre-colonial history of this land and the people who lived here and continue to live here. The cultures and spiritualities of Indigenous peoples are connected to the land, and the land is an integral part of their ways of knowing and living. These knowledge systems are continually evolving in relation to the land and its other inhabitants, both human and other than human. The Kingston Indigenous community continues to reflect the area's Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee roots. There is also a significant Métis community, and there are First Peoples from other nations across Turtle Island present here today. So I'd like to take this time to welcome and introduce our speaker for this evening. Growing up in the industrial landscape of Northern England, Megan Quinn didn't fully realize her passion for nature until she moved to Canada in 2004. After graduating from the Ecosystem Management Technician and Technology programs at Sir Stamford Fleming College, she worked a variety of jobs in the environmental field with a focus on the nonprofit sector. Since 2018, Megan has led the Nature Conservancy of Canada's Eastern Ontario Stewardship Team as the Coordinator, Conservation Biology in Eastern Ontario. She routinely volunteers in Europe to share environmental knowledge with international ecologists. In her spare time, Megan is a competitive horse rider and enjoys creative expression through novel writing and knitting. Megan, we are very excited to learn from you tonight, and I'll pass it along to you now.
So hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's a pleasure, as always, to come and talk about what I love the most, which is the environment. And today we will be talking about invasive species in the Frontenac Arch. So I'm just going to start very briefly by going over a little bit about the Nature Conservancy of Canada, which is the organisation that I work for. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, the Nature Conservancy of Canada is Canada's largest land conservation organisation. We're a charity that partners with individuals, corporations, foundations, Indigenous communities, and governments at all levels to protect Canada's most important natural areas. And we do that through the securement and long-term stewardship of our properties. Now, this map here is a little bit outdated, but it does go to show that we really are working from coast to coast to coast, and we have projects in all provinces. And since our founding in 1962, with the help of our partners, we have helped to protect 14 million hectares, or 35 million acres across the country. We've got a great introduction to the partnership that we have with Queen's University here in Eastern Ontario with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, and it's really allowed us to do some absolutely fantastic work. Not only do we have the Elbow Lake Environmental Education Centre as a sort of a joint initiative through the co-ownership of the Elbow Lake property, but back in 2018, I actually moved my office to the Queen's University Biological Station. And this has just really allowed that partnership to grow and provided such a fantastic opportunity for my summer technicians that I get every year, usually a fresh batch of university students who are keen to learn about the environment, have really been able to immerse themselves in all of the research happening at the biological station, and as well vice versa, having the researchers come out and help us with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. So we are super thankful for the work that we're able to do with Queens, this just being one of many examples. So I think you got a pretty good mention of who I am and what I do, but as mentioned, I'm the coordinator of conservation biology for Eastern Ontario with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And what that means is, although I wear a lot of hats, I'm responsible for the supervising and implementing of all of the on-the-ground stewardship work that happens on our properties in Eastern Ontario. And I've been doing that since 2018. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here today to talk about invasive species in the Frontenac Arch. So these are just pictures of some of the beautiful landscapes that we're familiar with. And I'm really lucky to wake up every morning and excited to go to work. And it's because this is my office. We're so fortunate in this part of Ontario to have the Frontenac Arch on our back doorstep. And all 4 of these pictures here were taken within a 30-minute drive of the city of Kingston. So even though it feels like you're in quite an urban area, and you are when you're quite downtown Kingston, all of this nature is just on our back doorsteps, which is really a fantastic resource for everybody. And really, the opportunity that the Nature Conservancy of Canada has to protect these lands in the Frontenac Arch is remarkable. And it's something that everybody on this webinar is able to be a part of. And I hope that through my talk, I can explain to you a little bit about how we envision that being the case. So before I get into the invasive species, I think it's really important to take a step back and talk about what it is that we're trying to protect and why. It's not really much use for me to tell you about all the invasive species in the Frontenac Arch if you don't know what the Frontenac Arch is and you don't care about it. And it's actually one of my favorite places. It's really incredible. So this is the Frontenac Arch. You can see the yellow outline on the map. It's found in the eastern section of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence ecoregion. And the natural area that you see here extends from the St. Lawrence River, just east of Kingston, north to just beyond the boundary of Frontenac Provincial Park. And then you can kind of see it scoops around the St. Lawrence there. And it is designated a UNESCO World Biosphere Reserve. And I could do an entire presentation on why the Frontenac Arch is so special, and actually I have done just that. But to summarize it, firstly, it has the highest amount of natural cover in southern Ontario, south of the Canadian Shield, and is the last intact forest corridor in eastern North America. And you can actually see that if you look at this map. Everything inside of that yellow boundary looks a lot greener than everything outside of it. So we have this really special area of forest cover. And actually in the Frontenac Arch, we're sitting at just over 70% forest cover. So it's quite a special place. And because of that, what it does is it acts as a critical migration corridor from the Adirondack Mountains in America to the Algonquin Highlands. This is often referred to as the A2A corridor. So even though the Nature Conservancy of Canada only works on the northern or the Canadian portion of the Frontenac Arch, it does extend down into America as well. And one of my favorite things about it is you get this really great area of species overlap. So species that you would normally find in the south, the Frontenac Arch is about how far north they get. And species that you normally find in the north, the Frontenac Arch is about how south they get. And the result of this is a narrow band that supports one of the highest densities of rare species in Ontario. And just to put some numbers to that, so the Ontario Natural Heritage Information Centre, they track species at risk all across Ontario. They are currently tracking approximately 94 terrestrial and aquatic species in the Frontenac Arch, including 44 federal species at risk and 11 globally rare species. So we have a lot packed into a really small area. But then, on top of it being ecologically really important, it's also really beautiful. And I think that's also a really important reason to protect it and to like it, because we go there when we go to our cottages or we go for a hike, and we just appreciate what that landscape looks like. And invasive species that I'm going to talk about today are actually a threat to not only the ecology of the Frontenac Arch, but also these beautiful views that we see here as well. So we all have a role to play in making sure that these beautiful places stay beautiful. So what are invasive species? It's not enough to say that a species is just from somewhere else. Invasive alien species are plants, animals, and microorganisms that are not native to an area, but have been introduced to it, either intentionally or unintentionally, and they cause harm to the ecosystem, the economy, and/or society. So true to their name, these introduced species often invade new habitats, outcompeting native plants and animals, and reducing overall biodiversity. And actually, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature considers alien invasive species to be the second most significant threat to global biodiversity, only second to habitat loss. So it's quite a serious issue that we're looking at here today. And as you can actually see from these pictures, they change not only how our landscapes look, but how they function. So this is a picture of a Japanese spurge removal event that we had with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And you can see that once an invasive species really gets into some of these areas, it completely changes how it looks and how it functions. And these pictures were actually taken in early March of last year. So you can see the trees haven't even really begun to bud and leaf out yet, and we already have these invasive species coming in and outcompeting for space and resources. But what's the big deal? And really, the introduction of invasive species can have a dramatic effect on our natural resources, human health, and the economy. So if you think about a natural or native community, you get species that evolve together in an ecosystem that has a lot of really intricate balances to it, some that we aren't even aware of, even after studying them for decades. Everything kind of has its own niche within the ecosystems. Things such as predators that limit the population growth of any one species. You get this really nice melding of all of the species that live in balance with each other. But when you introduce an invasive species into one of these systems, they don't have the same kind of natural control, and therefore the invasive species can outcompete the native species for food and habitat, and sometimes we actually lose species because of this. If they get outcompeted so much, they can be locally extinct. So what do they do that's so bad? They destroy natural habitat for food and wildlife, they reduce biodiversity. In an agricultural system, they will reduce productivity. They can decrease your property value. You may have once had a really nice lakefront property that you could see out onto and see all these nice little islands and a rocky sort of area of the Frontenac Arch, and now you have a whole stand of Phragmites that's come up in there. So aesthetically, they can have issues there too. Something else that people don't necessarily think about is the increased costs associated with invasive species. So every year, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we pay thousands of dollars to remove and better understand invasive species. And as a conservation biologist, it makes up a large portion of my summer dealing with issues like the pictures you can see here. Invasive species destroy recreational opportunities and the aesthetics of the landscape. And we also have some that are potentially toxic to animals or humans. So I know wild parsnip is one that's been in the news quite a lot lately, which can cause quite severe burns to people. So how do invasive species get here? There are many ways that alien invasive species spread. They can spread in the fur or excrement of our livestock and wildlife, on vehicles, ATVs, snowmobiles, and boats. If people go hiking, you can get them little seeds, little plant parts stuck to your boots, stuck to your clothes. If you go for a bike ride, you can get them in the tires. There are also natural ways that invasive species spread as well, such as by wind or water or wildlife. Also in an agricultural system, you can see instances of contaminated hay or seeds getting into wildflower or bird seed mixes. Sometimes we get people's escaped ornamental plants. people think they have a really nice plant that they want to put in their garden, which actually then makes its way into the natural systems and can cause a really big problem. And goutweed and periwinkle are examples of those that we find often in our natural areas that we think have come from people's gardens, as well as people that intentionally dump their organic waste. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later, but I think a lot of people look at organic materials, whether it's things from their garden, when they're clearing up in the spring, and they think, well, I don't really have the room to do anything with it, but it's green, so I can put it in the forest because all that stuff's green as well. But on quite a few of our properties, this is the #1 way that we find invasive species getting in. You had some seeds in your garden or a plant in your garden that maybe stayed in your garden, but once it's out into the natural system, not in a pot or in a planter, it can really make its way around. And the food imports as well. So we import a lot of food, a lot of materials, and all of these things tend to come in wooden pallets. So historically, that was a really big way that a lot of our invasive species that we're dealing with today, especially the invasive insects, made their way into our country. And really today, our world is more globally connected than it ever was before. And there's a lot of benefits to this. If you think back even 50 years ago, people really did not have the same opportunities that we have today to engage in this global world. But we can't deny that this makes it easier for invasive species to spread at an unprecedented rate. So when you're standing in the Frontenac Arch on a rocky ecosystem like this rock barren that I have a picture of here, this is on our Whitefish Lake property. If people are familiar with the Frontenac Arch in the area, it's sort of just south of Sealy's Bay. You might think that you're not really globally connected. You don't necessarily feel that you're part of, kind of the hustle and bustle of the world going on around you, but you really are. We're never really that far away from something that has traveled quite a far distance. So it's important to always be aware of invasive species and how you can do your part when you're out in natural spaces to make sure that you aren't inadvertently spreading things around. So I'm almost about halfway, but I'm just going to pause to take a brief question period before we get into some of the specific invasive species that we can find in the Frontenac Arch. So if you have any questions about the Nature Conservancy of Canada or the Frontenac Arch, or kind of general invasive species questions, now would be a great time to ask them. After the break, I'm going to get into specific species, some control methods for them, and then really what you can do to help combat invasive species in your own homes and your own environments. And there's also, as mentioned, going to be time for questions at the end too. So if you think it's going to be something that I might be covering in the next section, please feel free to leave it until the end. But until then, let's see if anyone has any questions.
I just have one question. Someone says, I've heard that zebra mussels are an invasive species. Do you know how they got here?
Yes, so zebra mussels are an invasive species, and to my knowledge, a lot of the aquatic invasive species that we get have come in the form of ballast water. So when we have a lot of kind of big vessels crossing the oceans, they use ballast to, I don't exactly know what they use it for, but something to do with balancing and docking, and that probably isn't actually it. But ballast water does need to be dumped, and if they're picking up ballast water from one system and bringing it into another, that can then, you're also transporting microscopic little creatures in there as well, and zebra mussels could be one of those. And then once they're in our lake systems, it's really easy for people to spread them around from one lake to another. So if you take your boat, you're just out for a nice paddle on a canoe, or you have a motorboat and you've got it in a lake, and then you take it out, and maybe the next day you're taking it to another lake, or even in the same day, you could be taking aquatic invasive species with you. And that's why we always recommend that people clean off their boats. There's a protocol you can do, and I'm happy to share that with people, to be able to make sure that you're properly disinfecting moving between water bodies. And in the Frontenac Arch, we definitely have a lot of zebra mussels. I'm most familiar with the area around Loughborough Lake, but typically, aquatic invasive species are incredibly difficult to get a hold of and get a handle on, because a lot of them can be so microscopic when they're small, and really grow and become quite a big problem, and they spread fairly easily.
Wow, thanks so much, Megan.
I wish I knew more about what ballast water did now, but
Did it have something to do with keeping boats afloat? I'm
yeah,
sorry.
I think it's like a weight distribution thing.
We have a nice comment from Beth. They said, loving this, keep moving on.
Okay, excellent.
Had,
We'll do that.
might be a follow-up question, I'm not sure, from Milad. I'm so sorry if I have pronounced your name wrong. They said they are naturalized as far as I know, right?
So when we talk about a species being naturalized, especially when it comes to an invasive species, so sometimes, like, not all species that are alien or from a different place really cause a problem. And what we tend to see with a lot of species is they arrive, we get kind of a big spike, and then they sort of level out, and the system sort of naturally adapts to be able to deal with them. Predators kind of figure out what's going on. And some species never really get to the level of being invasive to the point that we want to do something about them. So if you think, so a lot of the species that you kind of see out and about are not native species. Off the top of my head, if I the dandelion. So everybody knows dandelions. Everybody knows they sort of get everywhere, but as a conservation organization, we're not going around trying to eradicate all dandelions or eradicate all earthworms, because even though they are not a species that is historically been here, they're not species that our systems have adapted with. And it's not to say that a naturalized species can't cause damage to an ecosystem, but it's not as widespread, and it's not going to wipe something out. So we sometimes do have species that are sort of more alien as opposed to invasive, would be the term that we'd use in the conservation community. To my knowledge, specifically on zebra mussels, I consider them an invasive species. They do cause a lot of issues for our native communities in that they, like all mussels, are filter feeders. So they will take sort of a very murky system, and they'll filter it. So you get a really clean lake, which sounds excellent until you realize that a lot of the species that are in that lake rely on that sort of murky water for their habitat, and the zebra mussels are taking out the nutrients from the system that really are needed. So in the case of zebra mussels, not to make this too long-winded, a lot of times it's that we're not really able to do much about them because aquatic invasive species are so difficult. There's only so many treatments that we can do to an aquatic system, and because it's also connected, it's incredibly difficult. But I would not consider a zebra mussel to be naturalized.
Great, thanks so much, Megan. I think that those are some really great examples that we can keep in mind.
Cool, okay.
I think that's all the questions for now. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to type them as you think of them, and then we can have another question period at the end if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. So let's talk about a few of the invasive species that we find in the Frontenac Arch. So the first species I want to talk about is Phragmites australis, which is also known as common reed or just Phragmites. Common reed is a large perennial grass. It grows up to about 5 meters tall. And although it grows in all wetlands, it's often found growing in roadside ditches. And if you spend any time driving along Highway 401 or the 417 towards Cornwall, you have definitely seen this plant. And it's one of those things that you don't notice it's there. And I think a lot of invasive species are kind of guilty of this, is you kind of go a bit plant blind, but once you recognize it, you see it absolutely everywhere, and you see how much of an impact it's actually having. And I guess really, so the point of my presentation here today is not to teach you how to identify all of these species, because there are so many of them, and I'm only going to highlight a few. But really, it's just to kind of get you thinking about invasive species, and then also talk about what can actually be done. But this plant, it was originally from Europe and Asia, and the species has invaded many wetlands in eastern North America. It outcompetes our native wetland plants and is a serious threat to biodiversity. So once you get Phragmites in an area, the plant's roots spread far and wide below wetlands in a vast network of rhizomes. And even just a tiny part of these rhizomes, if it breaks off, can sprout out a new plant. So even when you are doing removal, it's incredibly difficult to get rid of the full thing. We do have native Phragmites, but the height of how tall this plant gets, up to 5 meters, and how densely it grows makes it quite recognizable. And the problem here is that you get really thick stands of it, as you can see. Usually you get a complete monoculture, as we would call it. So it's only Phragmites growing. It outcompetes everything else in there. And it grows so tightly, actually, that you get some of these animals that rely on these wetlands, like turtles and snakes, actually can't move through it. And we have had instances of turtles that have gotten stuck in the middle of a Phragmites patch and have unfortunately died because they haven't been able to navigate through it. Even just walking through them, trying to do control methods, it can be very overwhelming because you have Phragmites in all directions and above you. So definitely a very recognizable invasive species on the landscape. It does provide some habitat for species. There are birds that will nest in stands of Phragmites, but it's really not preferable for them because it outcompetes everything else. So you really don't have the same sort of insect support in those communities to be able to feed young. The second species I'm going to talk about in the Frontenac Arch is garlic mustard. So this was originally brought to North America by early colonists, and this invasive plant is now spreading across the continent at a rate of over 6,000 square kilometers a year. So to put that into perspective, that is an area about 10 times the size of Toronto every single year, and it moves. So this was originally brought over as a garden plant and escaped from people's gardens into our natural systems, and that's because it has uses in cooking. So as the name suggests, garlic mustard, it has quite a garlicky taste and smell to it, and that's one of its key identification features, is that if you crush the leaves, you definitely get a good garlic odor. In its first year, you get these really small little rosettes that you can see kind of in the bottom picture there. And then in its second year, which the first picture is kind of starting to show, is it pops up and will grow up with these sort of white flowers at the top, and that's when it goes to seed. The way that it's spread is kind of facilitated by white-tailed deer they've found. So the deer don't really like to eat the garlic mustard, but they'll eat pretty much everything else. So they eat around all of the other plants that had a chance of trying to compete for space, and just leave open more room for the garlic mustard to be able to spread. As well as it's a common one in forest understories, so you get people hiking or ATVing off trails, helping to spread those seeds around as well. And like many invasive species that we find, it is one of the first plants to emerge in the spring, which gives it a competitive advantage in that it's able to get a good head start on some of our spring ephemeral species like trilliums or trout lilies that need a little bit more time. But by the time they pop up, if there's garlic mustard in a system, it's already taken up all of the space that these native species need. As well, like some invasive species, it can change the forest's composition by changing actually the soil chemistry, so it makes it unfavorable for other plants to be able to grow. European buckthorn, or just common buckthorn, is native to Eurasia. It was first introduced to North America as an ornamental shrub for fence rows and wildlife habitat. So scientists don't always get it right. We try our best. But really, what was intended to actually protect the environment and help to mitigate some of the impacts from agriculture has actually turned out to be a much bigger problem. And that problem is buckthorn. So this tree or shrub, usually it grows quite shrubby, very dense, multiple stems coming up from the ground, but it is a woody plant. It can tolerate a wide range of moisture and light conditions. They grow throughout the Frontenac Arch in a wide variety of habitats, and we often find them in our woodlands and open fields. It crowds out other native plants, can alter the nitrogen levels in the soil, which prevents native species from growing. And as you can see by these pictures, they also produce a large number of berries. So these black berries here are quite a good indication that you have buckthorn, and especially if you are coming through sort of late autumn and even into the winter, they still hang around. So that's a good key identification feature. As well as the leaves too. So it leaves out fairly early in the spring, and it's one of the last plants to drop its leaves. I have been doing control in sort of November, early December, and this plant is still green. Usually it's a pretty good indication if you find any plant that is still green in February or November. It's probably not meant to be here, and it's worth looking into some investigation on if that's actually an invasive species. And then the next one that's quite common in our area is dog strangling vine. So European swallowwort, which is often called dog strangling vine, is a member of the milkweed family. And despite its name, it does not strangle dogs, but it does pose a significant risk to our native plants and habitats. So it's native to Eastern Europe and arrived in Canada with European settlers approximately kind of 100, 120 years ago, and has become established throughout many parts of southern Ontario and is continuing to spread at quite an alarming rate. If you sort of take a look at the plant, it has these sort of pods, quite similar to how a native milkweed plant would have. And the seeds inside of it are white and feathery, which makes them really easy to disperse once the wind gets them when those pods open. The leaves also resemble milkweed leaves. They're oval-shaped and arranged oppositely across the plant stem. But a really good ID feature that I find when I'm out in the field is that dog strangling vine tends to be a little bit of a darker, shinier green than some of our native vegetation around it, and that can help pick it out if you're in a system with lots of other species in there as well. It does have these small pinkish maroony sort of flowers, which blooming just about now. I saw a couple starting to go to flower when I was out working in the field last week. So anytime now we're going to be starting to see those flowers pop up. And then the seed pods kind of tend to start appearing around June and continue to grow well into the autumn. And as well as all the other things that I've mentioned about why invasive species are bad, this species is particularly detrimental to our monarch butterflies. So these are a species at risk that lay their eggs exclusively on our native milkweeds. And the milkweed is the only plant that the monarch caterpillar has actually evolved to eat. And so what we found is some of these monarch butterflies are getting confused and laying their eggs on dog strangling vine instead. And when that's not a suitable plant for the caterpillar to eat, and unfortunately they then starve to death. So really when we're looking at invasive species, we're having these huge sort of landscape impacts, but also you really have to look at some of the smaller impacts that are being had on an individual species level. And that's what makes invasive species so damaging, is that we're seeing across the board reduction in biodiversity, a reduction in habitat types, and then also specific species that are having trouble with specific invasives that have come in. And that is a really small look at the whole list. As I mentioned, I haven't even touched on aquatic plants or any kind of insects or diseases that have come over. I could spend probably 3 hours trying to list you all of the invasive species, but I don't think this is a really good format to try and teach you all of them. And I also don't want this entire presentation to be all doom and gloom, because there really are real tangible things that we can do to help protect our environments against invasive species. So at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we employ a wide variety of invasive species control techniques. And really, this is figured out, it depends on the species, what kind of density we're looking at, how much of an area does it cover, what environmental conditions do we find it in, because there's really many ways to remove an invasive species. So a question I get asked a lot on some of these talks is, how do I remove species X? Or I have this in my garden, how do I get rid of it? And what I highly recommend to deal with situations like that is the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry have these really excellent guides that are called best management practices. So there's a best management practice for garlic mustard, there's a best management practice for buckthorn, and it's a document that gives information on how to control each species given a set criteria of conditions. So it looks at manual control, so digging out of the ground, as well as chemical controls, and in some cases, even biological controls as well, that might be in the works for some of these species. But how do we make an impact? So at the Nature Conservancy of Canada, we have a lot of land to manage, and in Eastern Ontario, we're looking at sort of just over 25,000 acres that I'm personally responsible for, and I am one person. I have an absolutely fantastic team of people, but even then, we don't top 3 or 4. So it's important that we involve people past ourselves, and one of the ways that we do that in the Frontenac Arch is through the Lowborough Wilderness Stewardship Team. So this is a group of volunteers that started in 2017 originally, and it's neighbours, nature lovers, students that come and help us do specific tasks. And a lot of these things include removing invasive species, trail monitoring, removing dump sites, kind of getting the organic waste out of the systems before the invasive species sprout and become a problem. So a little bit of preventative stuff as well. So all of these pictures on here were taken from different invasive species removal events. We have a buckthorn event, and a creeping jenny event, and a garlic mustard event. And typically in non-COVID times, we would be gearing up for a great field season of volunteer events to be able to invite you to come out and enjoy and help us tackle some of these bigger populations that we have on our properties. And really, there are plenty of volunteer opportunities throughout Eastern Ontario if people are interested in getting more involved with the Nature Conservancy of Canada specifically. There are always ways to get your hands dirty and get out on the land, but there's also a lot of work on the back end, things like helping us enter data, doing research, helping spread the word about what NCC can do. And even though our volunteer program is a little bit on pause right now, it doesn't mean that you can't get in touch, and we can find a way to have you help us. But even if you can't volunteer, the point of my presentation today is that there's plenty you can do at home to help out in the Frontenac Arch, especially with the issue of invasive species. And really, if I could highlight it, this is actually a critical part of the work we're trying to do for conservation. It's really all well and good for us to remove invasive species from our lands that we steward. By doing this, we're protecting critical habitat for species at risk. But we only have authority on our side of the fence. I can't tell you how many times I've spent a day removing buckthorn only to look across to the neighbour's property and there's an entire field of it. So that's where we have to think bigger, and we have to think on a landscape level, and we have to involve our communities in this battle, because that's really the only way we're going to make a difference across the landscape. So I believe that many of you on the call today do live or love the Frontenac Arch. In many cases, you might actually be a neighbour to a Nature Conservancy of Canada property. But all of the tips I'm going to talk about how you can help from home really apply wherever you are in the world to be a good environmental citizen. Private landowners have an opportunity to manage their property to improve its natural values and contribute to a healthy environment in a way that directly aligns with NCC's mission. And that means keeping invasive species out. And really, without landowners being able to take the pledge to be a good steward, we couldn't do conservation the way that we need to. So even though things are starting to open up right now, I know a lot of people are planning on spending some more time at home, especially when we look to sort of vacation season and getting out this summer. You may not be venturing out as far as you typically would. And that's a great opportunity to get to know the natural environment that's right in your backyard. And really take conservation into your own hands. I think that's really important. If you can take one message from my presentation today, it's that you can make a difference on invasive species in the Frontenac Arch. So this could be simple things. If you're out for a hike, take the time to clean off your boots when you get home, brush off your clothes to make sure you aren't carrying any seeds with you that you could distribute to other natural areas. If you're taking your dog out for a walk, dog's fur seems to just harbor seeds that they pick up, as well as it's really important to keep your dog on trail when you're keep your dog on a leash and on the trail when you're visiting a natural space. I'm a dog lover. I know how great it can seem to let your dog run off into the woods, but you could not only be disturbing some really sensitive spaces, but helping to spread invasive species around as well. So please keep your dog on a leash, and please keep your dog on trail, and yourself as well. If you see a new invasive species, or if you see something pop up that you haven't seen before, let someone know, whether that's me, whether that's your local conservation authority, whether you're recording it through the Invasive Species Awareness Program. If we have a record of something, we can actually do something about it. But if we don't know it's there, that's really hard to do. And invasive populations are a lot easier to manage when they're small. So acting quickly is a good way to make sure you're not having a big problem on your hands. If you own a boat or you spend a lot of time on the water, as I mentioned, make sure that you are taking time to clean your equipment thoroughly and drying it as well before you move from one body of water to the next. So things that you can do without actually leaving your house. The first is choose native species when you're gardening or designing your gardens. There are many native plants and flowers that attract your butterflies and bees and birds and all of those great things that we want to encourage to really improve biodiversity in our areas. And native species are actually much better for that than introduced species. As I mentioned right at the beginning, these are the species that our native animals have sort of evolved with over time, and you can have an absolutely beautiful garden and a very productive garden and a low maintenance garden if you choose native options. And definitely never plant invasive species in your garden. Second, it's really important to properly dispose of your yard waste. Even things like dumping leaf piles into the woods can be an issue. Because it can not only smother the native vegetation and make it easier for the invasive species to come up, you could be harboring invasive insects in brush piles, spreading things like the emerald ash borer around, which can be quite devastating to our forest ecosystems. And you can't tell just by looking at a brush pile or an organic waste pile necessarily whether you have invasive species in there. So it's always best to err on the side of caution. I would not come into your living room and dump all of my organic waste in it. So please don't do that on our Nature Conservancy of Canada properties or any natural spaces that you find yourself in. It's just good practice. And then if you can't responsibly deal with yard waste on your own property, make sure you contact the correct authorities to get advice. Your local municipality is a great person to reach out to find out good ways of doing that. And thirdly, find out if you have invasive species on your property. Do some time to take the research and find out what else lives there. I've given you 4 great examples of some common species, but it's definitely not the whole list. And there are many tools that can help you do that. You don't have to be a trained biologist to be able to start learning more about these species. And I especially find that learning what grows in my neighborhood makes me feel more connected to it. It makes me feel more connected to nature because I know something's name and I can give it its name. And I think that that's something quite special, that you walk in the woods and you know what things are, and you take the time to really take a look at each tree and see how they're different from one another. If you start to try and pick out invasive buckthorn, for example, you may also come across a lot of different native species that we have too, and gain a greater appreciation for those. I feel like I may be preaching to the choir at this point, but private land stewardship is important because it keeps not only our soil, our native vegetation, and our water bodies intact and healthy. It's beneficial to nature, it's beneficial to human health. Because when we place this kind of value on our natural resources, it directly translates to how we think and feel about them. and ensures that they're still around for our future generations to enjoy. If we protect this wetland now and don't let it get overrun with Phragmites, we can make sure that our children and our grandchildren are able to enjoy that wetland as well. So I keep talking about, like, figure out what an invasive species is, look it up, but how do you actually do that if you don't know what species are? How do you take that first step? And I think that's worth spending a little bit of time on. And one of the tools I want to introduce you to briefly to do that is called iNaturalist. And this really is just going to be a brief overview of how iNaturalist can be used to help enhance your experience in the Frontenac Arch and then help us protect it. So I encourage you to look more into it, but hopefully this gives you a little overview of some of the really cool bits of technology that are out there that are helping conservation. So iNaturalist is a platform for people to share observations of biodiversity across the globe. So if you look at this picture here, the gray dots each represent an observation. So there were over 25 million species in this screenshot I took in July 2019. And then as of this week, I took this one and we are over 38 million. So it's growing. And you can record everything in here. There is butterflies, grass, elephants. So it's not just limited to invasive species by any means. It's not limited to any species. The whole point is to get a good picture of biodiversity all across the globe. You can access it through the iNaturalist.ca website, and there is also a mobile application as well to be able to use out in the field. And so what do you actually do with it? You go out and you find species and you record them. And you don't necessarily have to know what they are. If you look on the right here, there are some that just say unknown. So those are people that have gone out and taken a picture of a plant or an animal or fungi, and they don't know what it is. But there is an amazing community of over 130,000 identifiers you can see here on this slide that do know what it is and would love to help you try and figure out what it is. So it's really a collaborative approach to conservation by connecting people that perhaps don't have that background in the environment with those that do. And another really fun feature that does is you can pick an area and explore it. So I like to use this whenever I'm traveling, but since I'm not really able to do that right now, I can pretend I'm traveling by going around the world and seeing what species I can find in some of the places that I want to travel. So I encourage you to try that out. And you might be surprised what people have found around your cottage or your childhood home, or even go find what people have found in your neighborhood. I think it's a great way for people to feel connected with each other, especially in these sort of troubling times where we're perhaps not feeling as connected. And just a quick note, the Nature Conservancy of Canada has a pilot project where we've uploaded some of our properties to iNaturalist, so you can see the property boundaries. And this is so both we can get a sense of what people are seeing on our properties, but also lets people interact with them as well, so they can see where our property boundaries are and see what's happening on their favorite Nature Conservancy of Canada property and know that they're contributing to the work that we do. So all of these observations that are done on Nature Conservancy of Canada properties in Eastern Ontario, I get to see. So I can't be out there all the time on every single property because I've got lots of them. So, but other people can, and we can definitely use that data. But the best tool of iNaturalist, especially for people that don't feel as confident with their identification, is the photo recognition software that they have. So this method isn't foolproof. I'm not going to tell you that it's going to identify everything that you are taking a picture of, but it is getting better and it really gives you a good starting point. So on iNaturalist, if you aren't sure of what you're looking at, you can take a picture and the app will automatically give you suggestions of what it thinks it is. And usually this gives you enough information to get started, and then that observation is then verified by other people. So even if you pick something and it's not quite right, that's okay. There's plenty of people out there that I think they almost do it as a hobby to go in and see if they can identify as many species as they can from other people's observations. And doing this will definitely help you narrow down what you're looking at. So here's an example of a plant that looks quite nice. I actually took a picture of it right outside of my office at the Queen's University Biological Station. And if I didn't know any better, I think it's quite nice. But plugged it into the app and asked for suggestions of what it might have been. And it has come up as periwinkle. So this is an invasive species. This can be quite damaging to our forest systems. It forms a very dense mat. So if anybody has periwinkle in their garden, they definitely know it's incredibly hard to get rid of. If you were someone who had put this into the app and didn't quite know what it was, now you can know that this is periwinkle and this is something that I have to do something about before it becomes a big problem in the environment. And then just for fun, I wasn't convinced that the software was really as good as it said it was, so I thought I would try and trick it. So here is a picture of me looking very wet. I was doing a field day last year. It was absolutely miserable. I was getting rained on. So I tried uploading this to iNaturalist just to see what would happen. I figured, it's just going to throw me up an error or something. But no, it actually identified me as a human, so which some would argue is an invasive species as well. But I was a little concerned it did think I could be a grey rat snake or a cucumber tree. But all that silliness just to say that it is a very cool piece of software that can be very helpful, and happy to chat offline with people if people are interested in getting set up with it. So I want to close with this question. Why do we bother dealing with invasive species? And it's something I get asked a lot, and I can see where that comes from. Why are we spending so much time, so much money, so much energy dealing with invasive species? And even though I've said all of the devastating things that can happen to them, I think we have to be realistic that in a lot of cases, we are not going to eradicate some of these species. They have gotten quite a hold in our ecosystem, and the best we can hope to do at this point is manage them. Some of our control methods aren't that effective. We're still waiting on new research to try and get a better handle on how these plants and animals are affecting our native ecosystems. What I do think is that it is really valuable to target invasive species work where it has the most impact. So as I mentioned at the beginning, in the Frontenac Arch, this is a really important area where we have so many rare and at-risk species and communities that rely on this habitat to live. So if we control a patch of Phragmites in prime Blanding's turtle habitat, it gives that species a place to live. If we wait, throw our hands up in the air and say, well, there's nothing we can do about Phragmites, it's never going to go away, we've taken that habitat away from that species that critically needs it. And who knows, maybe in 10 years we'll figure out a way to only take out Phragmites that doesn't impact any other species. But if we've waited that long, all of the turtles have lost their home already, and they're long gone. So I do think it's important that we take invasive species seriously, and we don't just get downhearted about the fact that we may not kill every single Phragmites stand. So this picture here is an example from one of our Nature Conservancy of Canada properties. This is a property around Loughborough Lake. And on the left, we have what the patch of Phragmites used to look like. And on the right, we have what it looks like after 3 years of treatment. So this picture, kind of looks like there's nothing really there anymore. And we've had some great success in that now the Phragmites is not there anymore, and we're actually starting to see native species pop up. So this picture was taken not in prime growing season, but my technicians went out last year and they're documenting new native species that are growing in to take that place. And every year we're removing a little bit less of the Phragmites. Like many invasive species, they have quite a big seed bank. So even if you think they're gone, they can pop up again, and it's just a lot of time. And you have to be patient, and you have to be persistent, and you have to keep going with it. But this proves that it can be done, and now this habitat is actually being used by native species and species at risk. And I'm going to close by saying that there is a place for everyone in conservation. I started by saying that, I'm going to end with it too. We can't be everywhere at once, we can't do everything, and that's okay. Because if we cast a wide enough net into the community, the data that we gather can be extremely valuable. You may have local knowledge of the area or of an invasive species that's around. You might be excellent at building spreadsheets and want to volunteer to do that. You may spread the word about invasive species or the work that the Nature Conservancy of Canada and other great organizations are doing in the Frontenac Arch. You might pick up litter when you walk in your local park and then remember to clean off your boots when you get home. Or you could be right in there killing the buckthorn in your own back garden to make sure it doesn't spread into the natural area across the road. Every single little bit helps, and everyone has to play a role in that. Although I do want to quickly mention that donating is another great way to get involved. As a charity, the Nature Conservancy of Canada, along with many others in this space, rely heavily on donations from the public to be able to complete this really important work. So if you've ever considered making a gift to the Nature Conservancy of Canada, please don't hesitate to contact me. I would love to put you in touch with the right people, whether that's a donation of money or a donation of time. It all makes a big difference to the work that we're able to do. So even though things may have seemed a little hopeless over the last few months, especially if we're thinking about invasive species on top of everything that's going on in the world, know that I value each and every one of you for the great work that you've done, and it's making a difference. The fact that you're willing to take time out of your Thursday evening to come learn about invasive species means that you're already well along your way to helping us out in the Frontenac Arch and helping to maintain it and keep it beautiful. So thank you for that, and thank you for coming on this conservation journey with the Nature Conservancy of Canada, because with your help, we're shaping how the Frontenac Arch not only looks now, but how it's going to look for generations to come. So thank you. That was my presentation on invasive species in the Frontenac Arch, and I'm super happy to take any questions if anyone has them. I'm very happy to chat everybody's ear off about invasive species, and if I don't have an answer for you, I'm definitely not an expert on everything. I'd be happy to find it out for you.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was a wonderful presentation, and I don't know about everybody else, but I am very inspired from you, so thank you. Just have a couple questions rolling in. The first one, Dave, says, are municipal roadside teams educated as to when to cut roadside, I think, species as to inhibit spread?
Yeah, so that's one of the big things. So I'd say probably in the last 5 to 10 years, there's really been a shift in conservation of we need to get everybody on board, even if they don't think that they are directly involved with invasive species work. Some of the things that they're doing are potentially problematic. So when we have people cutting down Phragmites on roadsides, it needs to be done for visibility. It can be a safety issue, and also things like drainage. But if you cut it at the wrong time, you're actually making the problem worse. And we're seeing this a lot with wild parsnip as well. So what the Nature Conservancy of Canada is doing is we have partnered with some local municipalities. I've been specifically in talks with South Frontenac and Kingston to try and get some education out there and get people talking about this issue. And there's been some great success. Lanark County has a wonderful program. So if you see this happening in your community, the best thing you can do is reach out to your local municipality and ask them, do you know about this? Do you have what we call clean equipment protocols? It's a set of standards for making sure you aren't spreading invasive species while doing any kind of construction or road activity. So I highly recommend checking that out and getting in touch with people in your local community, because if they hear that this is what people care about, they'll probably actually listen to me when I call them.
Awesome, thanks so much. The next question says, does NCC have any properties in the Niagara region?
Yes, so we work all across the country and all across Ontario. And if people want to get in touch with me, I don't have a map of our properties with me right now, but I'd be happy to direct people to if you want to take a look at our website, we have some great resources on there, natureconservancy.ca, or you can get in touch with me and I'd be happy to put you in touch with the contact in that area.
That's wonderful. The next question says, just wondering where the statistic of the spreading rate of garlic mustard, around 6,000 kilometers squared per year, came from. Do you know where I could find rates for other species?
That is a great question. I don't have it on hand, but I would be happy. I pulled it from some of my files, and I have a massive list of references that I can go and dig into, and I'd be happy to do that. So perhaps if you want to send me an email, the person that asked that question or anybody else that's interested in it, I have my email up on the screen there. I'd be happy to get that to you, because I agree, like I feel like those are the really impactful things. If you can kind of contextualize it a little bit of, it's growing this much per year, or it's spreading out in this area. I think that's really cool. But I'd be happy to get it to whoever asked that question.
Yeah, I just got a follow-up comment. They said they'll definitely send you an email, and they just wanted to express their thanks.
Oh, thank you.
Another question says, are there consultants or others who can help determine what is on our property and how we can help control invasive species?
Yeah, so the Nature Conservancy of Canada does it a little bit. I have consulted with some of our neighbours, but I can't, I guess in good faith, say that I can help everybody in the Frontenac Arch with their issues. If you think you're looking at something that is potentially dangerous, in terms of if you have kind of a wild parsnip patch that could be causing kind of human health issues, there are I recommend reaching out to your local township. The Ministry of Natural Resources can help with some things like that, as well as the Ministry of the Environment. But I would actually recommend that people use the iNaturalist community. I've had, even when I don't know what something is, so it's fairly obscure, I'm able to get a fairly good response on what that is. You can post it with what you think it is, you can post it with nothing. So if you have things in your garden that you aren't quite sure of, if you post a picture and take it on iNaturalist, that's probably the fastest and easiest way to get a response on what you're looking at.
Great, thanks so much. These are really great questions, everyone.
Oh.
I just had another person expressing their thanks.
Oh, thank you.
All the questions.
If you can't tell, I like talking about invasive species.
Another person said, very informative, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have another comment. Someone missed the first bit, but they just wanted to ask, is prickly ash invasive?
Oh, that's a great question. No. So it's, I've done a fair amount of work in our sort of lovely prickly ash communities, and they can be terrible to try and work around. But it's actually the northernmost member of the citrus family, fun fact. So prickly ash, it can be problematic, but it's not an invasive species.
It's good to know. We got another thanks again.
You're welcome.
If anyone else has any other questions, the floor is definitely open. Or if you'd like to send Megan an email, she's very open to receiving your emails as well. I have another question. Are sumac trees invasive or just problematic? I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
Yeah, so probably thinking of staghorn sumac, which is the one you sometimes see along roadsides. They get these sort of big red clusters and sort of a fuzzy stem. Note, they are not an invasive species.
Got another nice comment. Thank you very much for the informative and well done presentation.
Thank you.
So we've got some great feedback. Very informative. So thanks so much, Megan.
No, thank you for putting this together.
It was our pleasure. I think that's all the questions. But I just want to say thank you, Megan, for taking the time to share your knowledge with us tonight. We're very grateful for the opportunity to learn about invasive species from you, and we really enjoyed our time with you tonight.
Thank you.